All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Albertson. I am the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thanks, as always, for taking the time on a Monday morning to join us. Today, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Mr. Devin Ellis, who is a senior researcher at the Applied Research Lab for Intelligence Security, or ARLIS, at the University of Maryland, for his talk today titled Deus Ex Machina, Questions from Wargaming. As many of you know, CGSR, we've been doing some wargaming efforts for the last several years here at the lab, building some war games, sometimes as standalone exercises, sometimes as sort of support tools in conjunction with our workshops. It is a field which has existed for a long time, as Devin will go into, but it's a field which one is sort of enjoying a resurgence lately as people look at the complexities in the national security environment and they start looking at structured analytic tools that might help them understand this complexity and generate new insights regarding this complexity. So it's a field that's sort of enjoying a resurgence. It's also a field which is rapidly evolving as an analytic tool. And we've had speakers here in the past who have talked about how you see this moving from sort of an art, like a sort of guild-like scenario where you're doing everything with pen and paper at a table to a real sort of analytic science where much more is now being done online. People are looking at how you sort of create a digital scientific tool to do the same things that you used to do with pen and paper and human decision makers. So you have an ability now to do more in wargaming. You can do all sorts of different domains, combinations of different domains. You can do more players, you can do more game runs, you can generate more data. You can do all of this because you have more technological tools available now in wargaming. In particular, you see artificial intelligence being mentioned more in conjunction with wargaming. You see large language models being mentioned more in conjunction with wargaming. And this, people will argue, helps you with things like game design, helps you speed up adjudication, helps you improve data collection, data processing. But at its heart, right, wargaming is about human decisions, human actions based on things like emotions, human actions based on sometimes irrational things or things that are considered to be irrational for a computer. So where is this line between sort of the human element of wargaming and the technology element of wargaming? And Devin's going to get into that today. And I thought this was a really, really good talk for the lab based on everything we do here with high performance computing, everything we do here with simulation and modeling, and what we're trying to do here at CGSR with wargaming. So let me say a little bit about the speaker. He is a senior researcher, as I mentioned, at ARLIS. He's a policy analyst by training, and he began his career doing U.S.-China defense analysis and now runs a wargaming organization at ARLIS. He's designed and executed wargaming supporting every combatant command, force services, the Joint Staff, Office of Secretary of Defense, numerous component commands, the State Department, U.S. Institute for Peace, various parts of the intelligence and law enforcement communities. And in his current post as head of the Asymmetric Threats Analysis Center, he's leading a broad assessment of the relationship between AI and M&S and wargaming for the Basic Research Office in the Office of Secretary of Defense, RDT&E. So the ground rules, as always, the speaker's going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for discussion. You can raise your hand electronically. You can submit your questions to me in the chat. You can do both of those at any point while the speaker is talking. Like, don't feel the need to save those till the very end of his comments. Just get those in when you have the question, and then we'll get to those in the session. And that way, when Devin's done, as soon as he's done, I can start getting as many of your questions in for what I'm sure is going to be a lively discussion. So with that, Devin, thank you so much for being with us for the CGSR lecture series today, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So Mike already gave my entire talk in his opening comments, so we can be done now. And
Sorry. You have good slides though.
It's a really great pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you to the enormous number of people who are making time, especially first thing in the morning on the West Coast, or whatever time zone you're in. I won't waste time reintroducing myself. It was very nicely done, but any questions about background experience that come up, let's take them at the end of the time, because what I would really like to do is try and take about 30 minutes to go through the slides that I have talking about this problem and spend whatever time people are willing to commit to a Q&A, because I think really this is an unanswered questions presentation. So I'm going to do a bit of a overview of where I think this fits into wargaming that will involve a little bit of methodological postulating about wargaming to begin with, but then move rapidly into what we are trying to do here. I am required to inform you all that the views expressed in this talk are mine and mine alone, and do not reflect the position of the Department of Defense or any government agency or its subsidiaries. So with that, I'm going to share my slides and start powering through here. Cheesy Latin reference, sort of requisite for highbrow Defense Department or national security nonsense. But I think this really is the question, right? Is there the ability to do this? And that was alluded to in the intro. So there is a current project run by the Basic Research Office that is examining the relationship between modeling and simulation and artificial intelligence as it emerges with wargaming as an enterprise. We're interested in doing this to contextualize what best practices are, what the advances might be, to understand where we stand as a national security enterprise in relation to our potential adversaries, to our allies who are also doing this work, and to try and plot a way forward. And that's the context that I want to talk about with regard to wargaming and AI today. Let me dwell on this slide for a little while. I'm assuming that everyone on the call has at least some familiarity with wargaming, either professionally for a long time, casually, or they have a notion of it. But this is an epistemological depiction of wargaming that was come up with 30 plus years ago by my dearly departed friend Peter Perla, the sort of pope of wargaming at the Center for Naval Analysis for many years. And what it shows is what we like to call the virtuous cycle of analysis, where you have war games talking about the human factors of an analytical problem, situated between exercises, which are where are the gas cans and can we get down 95 today from A to B and do the keys work in the locks type of problems. And analysis at the bottom being a higher category of things that incorporates everything in your academic and analytic framework that feed into national security problems. But then when you look at that funnel that says decisions, that's where wargaming comes in, because at the end of the day, today, those decisions are still made essentially by human beings. And the judgments that they make are as susceptible to heuristic flaws as any human decisions. So doing wargaming is really essentially about targeting that part of this wheel. The exercises tell you the hardware problems, the tactical problems. The analytics tell you something about fundamental problems of whole wide variety, but the wargaming is supposed to tell you about, all right, now you throw those two things together and you ask a human or a group of humans to make choices. What choices are they going to make? And how do we support those? And to be honest, these days, how can we undermine those? And that's where we move on. But I want you to freeze frame this in your mind because I'm going to keep coming back to it. War games essentially have one of two purposes. They're either analytic or they're training. Analytic games are designed to explore problems that we don't currently understand and try and derive some kind of answers to them. And that can be a very small problem, or it can be a series of problems that are sort of, salami sliced, or it could be a very big problem that we have nothing on. But that's what we're doing a war game that's for analytic purposes to attempt is to get at an answer to something that we don't have an answer for currently. And it's important for me to say at the outset of this that understanding when we didn't get the answer is absolutely as important as understanding when we did. Training games are basically designed to convey knowledge and information to people who have to operate in an environment. It is very easy to conflate this, and one of the more common faux pas in the larger defense community in particular is not understanding that these things are very different exercises and that can't design for them in the same way. Some things are commonalities, and that is good, but other things really aren't. And ignoring the fact that they aren't, or ignoring the purpose for which you're trying to do a game, can be fatal. In either case, though, as I say here, war games are an opportunity to fail in high stakes missions in a very low stakes environment. And that is absolutely the purpose for both types of these games. You don't ask surgeons to do surgery without practicing. You don't ask pilots to fly planes without doing the simulator. Why should we ask anyone using a war game environment to be doing what their mission is without trying to figure it out first? So now let's move on to the narrower consideration for today, which has to do with this project of looking at how well or poorly we're doing the technical integration in wargaming. Every wargame, at its heart, is a fundamental trade-off between fidelity and playability. We do not have a world simulated ground truth. My dear friend Adam Russell tried to invent one at DARPA. We didn't quite get there. It's probably never going to happen. It's a reach goal for humanity, but we don't have it. So in any game, you are always making a choice between what the parts of the universe that you are simulating are most important to get exactly technically as correct as you can, and which parts you can handwave a little bit about. That is an essential characteristic of all war games. And the best designed war games always have that as the core question that you begin with. Wargaming has always incorporated some form of simulation. And this starts with dice rolling. It starts with the Prussians saying this little unit of miniatures in a sandbox can move so many centimeters per turn, etc. Like all of that is M&S, even if it's by hand, even if it's, as was said in the introduction, the sort of old-fashioned on-paper version. It still is simulation. It's just very old-school simulation. These days, now we have some war games that still do exactly that. And I have friends and colleagues, some of whom I didn't look at the roster, may be on this call, who literally still roll dice and use rulers in fire and maneuver war games. And that is totally cool. But we also have games like some that I've worked on that have enormously complex combined environments of systems dynamics models that are playing out hundreds of thousands of probabilities very rapidly. And those, they do exist. They particularly tend to exist in certain types of environments like cyber and space that really require things that are way beyond the human capacity to do rapid calculation. But there's also questions whenever you involve M&S in war games about, again, coming to the fidelity and playability part. How much realism do you need? How fast can you calculate that realism? And also, which parts of it need to be realistic versus which parts of it can be abstract and not impact the question that you are trying to answer with your game. Because if you don't know what question you're trying to answer, if you're just out there going, let's see what happens if we fight a war with the Lithuanians, then your actual analytic results are going to be poor no matter what the outcome of the game was. Especially because games in particular suffer from a restricted amount of N, and we'll keep talking about that. Oh, I was also going to say here, as I have in my slides, examples of good and bad integration of modeling and simulation. So bad integration of modeling and simulation is when you build a universe of models that don't answer the question, as I was just saying, for the game, or that don't care about the human. Because then why spend all the time and effort and money building models that are going to tell you something that's different than what your human players are going to tell you, unless that difference actually is part of your intent. Another example of bad M&S is when you build something on the basis of limited knowledge, but the customer doesn't know that. And so they take the output as having been validated with a capital V when it actually wasn't in any way. Good integration is when you use models and simulations to provide specific components of a war game that support adjudication, as was mentioned again in the introduction, by allowing sort of, let's call it 21st century level dice throwing that nobody in a white cell in a game is going to do by themselves. And good examples of integration include when you have a model that can give you some ground truth about decision making that you otherwise would be guessing at, and we'll return to that momentarily. So now AI enters the scene. Only it doesn't. You can read my first bullet point here, there's not AI. There are just scary good LLMs. When we have real AI, I think we'll all see it and we'll cope with it then. So what does that mean for wargaming and M&S AI junctions? We don't know yet. These are just postulations. These are my questions, ideas, my brain droppings, having been looking heavily at this space for a little while. If the purpose of wargaming is not to lose the human element of decision making, then what's the purpose of incorporating AI? In the intro, the question was asked of like, well, why not just replace humans, right? So, okay, if we take it as a given that we're not going to replace humans entirely, and I'm not saying we do, but for wargaming purposes, we have to, right? Then the point of AI and M&S is to either provide decision support or to accurately portray actors who you cannot, for practical reasons, have at the table. And that is a broad category, right? You could not have people who are opponents for obvious reasons. You could not have people who are allies because it's classified in a certain way. You could not have populations because they're denied. Or you could not have populations just because you can't get accurate polling data on them. All these are very good reasons to accurately depict humans the way you would in a simulation, but in a queryable form. Moving on to the next bullet point here. Again, this is in the brain droppings category. Some articles were recently published about how AI as a decision support tool would be dangerous because it seems like ChatGPT chooses to nuke everyone all the time in war games when they play it online. And I just worked on a DARPA program that examined some of these questions about agents playing games. And it seemed very straightforward to me after having done that, that there's a perfectly obvious rationale for this, which is they're trained on the open internet. What does the open internet data have on war games? It has a whole lot of diplomacy history and a whole lot of other games that are fundamentally zero-sum games where there's no shadow of the future. It doesn't matter if you nuke me because you don't have to talk to me tomorrow and you won. That obviously is not analogous to real life. And so this leads us down to one of the big questions that does have to be answered, which I think is not so much that the technology isn't getting to the point where it can provide really legitimate decision support. It's that the technology isn't being trained to provide really legitimate decision support. And the current model for training is a commercial one. And so it is based on a huge N of data. So how do we get to training the decision support model on much more discrete questions with much smaller data sets? And that's one of the big asks that I think we as a national security community have to be after with this technical horizon. Now, moving on to the second one, pathologies of representations of humans. You can read my slide as I talk if you like. I'm not going to go through it bullet by bullet, but fundamentally, we just suck at this. And that's largely because we instantiate all of our models on the basis of extremely biased and extremely small inputs. Unless we're doing real polling. And even then, anyone who's watched any election that's happened in a Western democracy in the last 10 years would tell you that even the best polling techniques right now aren't that great at telling you how people really feel about things, and have in fact trended worse over time, not better. So that's a question for the polling and stats guys that I don't actually have my arms around. But what I do believe firmly is that if we're going to attempt to represent people, whether as individuals or as groups through AI, then the instantiation has to have some kind of ground truth that is closer to reality than what we have now. Because anybody who's played with ChatGPT can tell you that it lies, it dissimulates, it does all manner of things. So this is my last one. I don't know how many people will recognize the quote, but the point is, sponsors love a frenzy. There is a frenzy for the application of AI to wargaming right now. We, as a community of practice, have an obligation to avoid getting swept along in the tide here. Because if we don't know what we're talking about, then none of it really means anything. And I was trying to be a bit jocular with my second to last bullet point here, but it's true. I have sat on the other side of the desk. And if you cannot explain what's in the black box, then I'm not going to rely on it. The number one thing that I, as a human policy decision maker, fear is that I can't explain why I made my choice. So if my decision support aid cannot explain why it made its recommendation, then I'm going to not use it. And I'm going to use my gut instinct or some other means by which I can justify myself. And now, just a note to my dear friend Peter, who passed away this year, over to you all.